Good morning, everyone. As a visitor from Wajambara Idingi country, I'd just like to acknowledge the Gimoy Wanabara and Idingi and Yiraganji people as the traditional owners of this country. Oops, go back. That worked. Okay. What I'm going to do in this talk is really just give you a bit of a review of the outcomes, the impacts of the NESP Cots IPM research to date. I'm not going to go into the details of how this was done. That'll be covered in a range of different talks during the proceedings over the next 2 days. I want to talk about what's happened out there in terms of our ability to control Cots and what that means in the longer term. Now, when we first got involved with crown-of-thorns starfish, there was a really strong message that manual control was not, it didn't work, it wasn't effective, it was prohibitively expensive, and we needed to focus on other things. But when we started looking very hard at what those other things might actually be, it was pretty obvious that all of them, even the most hopeful of them, were long-term prospects, long-term possibilities. And so if we wanted to do something quickly, immediately, or even in the medium term, we really needed to focus on manual control. And so that's what we did. And we set about going through a process where we asked the question, what are the objectives of a manual control program likely to be? What's the ecology of the system, of Cots and the reef? What's the ecology of the operations, the control program itself? And what do those things mean for how we are likely to go about controlling Cots? And because we didn't actually know the capability of manual control at the time, we decided that we needed to focus at the smallest scale of operation. You have to be able to control a site if you're going to be able to control a reef, if you're going to be able to control a region, before you can actually control the Great Barrier, Cots on the Great Barrier Reef. So we started at that site scale, and we went through and identified the decisions that have to be made, the actions that need to be taken, and then considered what it was that managers needed to do. And from that, we identified what the research needs were. All of that is integrated into a decision framework, which came out as a report that Cameron Fletcher was the senior author on at the beginning of last year. And he will talk about that in some detail in his own talk, I'm hoping. But what that does is it allows managers to make decisions, it guides them through that decision process so that they can effectively deploy divers, vessels, and they can plan voyages to achieve particular objectives at the scale of the site, a reef, or a region. So where have we got to with all of that? Well, that program was rolled out across the entire fleet starting in November 2018. It's still running as we speak, but I'm going to talk about the outcomes based on data from the period of November 2018 through till the end of July 2020. So the first, whatever that is, 20 months or so of the program. I just want to make one point here though, and that is that the program's official objective is to push Cots densities down to below a level at which coral growth outpaces their predation. Now, based on Eva Plagani and her colleagues' work, that's on the order of about 4 or 5 Cots per hectare. Now, that's an objective that is focused on outcomes at a site, ensuring that coral can actually do better than Cots can feed. In this talk, what I'm going to use is what I think is a more appropriate objective, and that is an objective that comes from Jacob Rogers. There he is over there, sharp young fella. This is a density of Cots below which the reproductive success of that population is estimated to be minimised. And that encompasses that coral protection objective, but it also impacts future reproduction and recruitment. And so that's a threshold which is actually targeting the larger GBR scale objective of reducing spread, which I think is a more appropriate objective for the program as it's currently operating. So I'm going to use that, 3 Cots per hectare, as my measure of success. How have we done? Well, we've done pretty well overall. So In that sample period that I'm dealing with, the Cots program dealt with 202 reefs. And what that entailed was that they would arrive at a reef and they would do the man-to-toe, the shark fishing experiment. They'd go around and they would get an idea of, they'd use that data to tell them whether they needed to dive at a reef to cull cots or not. 99 reefs, they chose not to dive, and at 103 reefs, they decided they needed to conduct culls, and they went ahead and did that. And in that period, they reduced cots at the scale of the reef, perimeter, they reduced cots down to below that threshold at 89 of those reefs. 14 were still being managed at the time. When they decide to dive, they implement around the reef, all the accessible areas of the reef, control sites. These are 10 hectares each, and they dealt with 884 control sites over that period, and they managed to push 624 of those down to below the threshold, about 260 still going. The critical thing here is that the average density at a site where culls were commenced was 19 cots per hectare, and by the time they would close a site, they'd reduced, by the time the sample period finished, whether they'd closed the site or not, the average density had been reduced down to less than 1 cots per hectare, 0.8 per hectare, which is that's really nice, because that tells us that they are able to effectively overachieve and get well below that reproductive threshold. And it doesn't actually cost too much to do this. The average site required between 6 and 7 voyages to bring it down below that threshold and to be closed. And for the average reef, it was 14 visits. Most sites and most reefs are reduced in less than that sort of a time period, but there are a couple of really extreme ends to that. There's, I think, one reef we've gone to 39 times, and at least at the end of this period, and are still going to. So there are recalcitrant reefs, but on average, things go pretty well. Now, it's important to realise we're making a decision to dive or not to dive, to cull or not to cull at a reef. And 99 reefs, the decision was made not to go there and cull. And it's worth asking, was that a good decision? And the reason you might want to ask that is because when we go back and we look at man-to-toe data and we say, what does man-to-toe tell us about the density of cots at a reef? The answer is it tells us absolutely nothing. Man-to-toe data is really completely and utterly unreliable for estimating density. But in this case, we're not using it to estimate density. We're using it as a trigger to dive or not to dive. So we can go and we can look at those 103 reefs, and we can use that data to tell us whether that decision rule is a good, reliable rule. So the decision rule is that if you see no cots or cots feeding scars, then you don't need to dive. And so that's that first set of rows in that table. What that's telling us is that in the 33 reefs where we dived despite the fact that no cots or feeding scars were seen, only one of those 33 reefs was above the threshold, the 3 cots per hectare threshold. So our decision rule not to dive at a reef when we see no cots or feeding scars is actually very reliable, 97% reliable. 3% is a small error. We don't want to make that much error, but it's a manageable error. On the other flip side, though, when we see cots or cots feeding scars, the error we can make there is that we might dive when we don't need to. And in actual fact, we make that error very frequently. But in the scheme of things, that is an affordable error. If we dive a site that doesn't need to be dived, we lose time. But if we don't dive a site that needs to be dived, then we risk having the outbreak run on and we don't protect coral. So the costly errors are made rarely, the affordable errors are made often. And that's not perfect, but it's reasonably fit for purpose. What's nice here too is that this data suggests to us that we are able to detect COTS densities reliably for management purposes, right down to well below 1 COTS per hectare, down to about 0.5 COTS per hectare. So that's the IPM strategy is working reasonably well. what's been the consequences for the performance of the program? And to look at this, what I'll do is compare data from before we started the IPM work, 2013 through to 2015. I'll compare that with the data from that sampling period after the IPM was introduced across the whole fleet. And what you can see in this, or I hope you can see in this table, is a series of performance metrics, and then the performance of the pre-IPM program, so before 2015, compared to the IPM program, and then just assessments of the scale that that's operating at. And in the top block, what we're looking at are metrics that are telling us about how well we're able to kill Cots. And what you see in that is that the pre-IPM program was really good at identifying places to go with high densities and was able to kill on the order of twice as many Cots as occurred under the IPM program. So it was a really effective measure of killing crown-of-thorns starfish. But when you come down to the next two blocks, what you're looking at is metrics that are informing you about the ability of the program to meet its objectives. And there, what you see is that under the IPM program, it takes less than half the amount of time to reach that 3 Cots per hectare threshold, which means that you lose roughly 60% less coral under the IPM program than you did under the pre-IPM, under the earlier program. And you achieve that threshold with double the probability that you would have under the previous program. Under the current program, under the previous program, average density at the end of the program was 4 times our 3 Cots per hectare threshold. Under the current program, it's 2/3 of that. So even when we haven't finished a site, we're still pushing it way down, much lower than we were previously. And we're reaching the threshold in 88% of the cases under the current program. Really importantly, and this speaks to the objectives of the two programs, current program is achieving its outcomes at about 92% of the reefs. So it's managing the entire perimeter and accessible areas in 92% of cases, whereas the previous program did it in exactly 0% of cases. So the IPM program has turned an effective culling tool into a really potent means of achieving program objectives at the scales that we're actually interested in. So we've got a great tool and we're using it effectively. What does this mean for how we might deal with the next outbreak? And I'm going to go on a very hurried little thought experiment here. The next outbreak is going to be a very different situation. We're going to have, if we're going to be successful, pest species or invasive species and pest species management tells us we have to act immediately, as soon as there's any hint that there's likely to be an outbreak. Otherwise, it's going to get away from us. It also says that we have to manage in appropriate places. And so for this little experiment, I'm going to assume that the next outbreak is going to start in the initiation box. Experience tells us this is the case, but theory and a bit of data also tells us that we might need to manage more than just the initiation box. And you can see on that little plot, I've marked where the initiation box is, and I've identified 2 areas that I'm going to call the dispersal boxes. This covers where we think the outbreak will occur and where it might get to in a 4-year period. Now, happily for us, that also represents the part of the GBR where we have the fewest reefs and the smallest reef area. So it's the place to do it because it's the place it's going to be the easiest. It needs to be our focus, but it shouldn't be the exclusive focus either. So how well does our capability scale to that? Well, here I've shown the average performance for a vessel under the IPM program in the central column. The average vessel is controlling about 23 reefs, towing about 23 reefs, about 1,000 kilometres amount of tows a year. It's culling at 12 and it's finishing off just roughly almost 11 of those reefs. And culling over about 1,000 hectares and bringing about 3/4 of those to completion in a single year. We can multiply that up by 5 vessels, and over that 4-year period that we might expect the outbreak to stay within the initiation and dispersal boxes. And if you look at those numbers, those are pretty significant areas. So the program has real capacity here. How does that match against those areas? I can't use to do that comparison, I can't use those numbers because I don't know what the control areas, etc., and the man-to-toe routes would be under the control program. So what I've done is, in the right-hand column, I've gone and looked at what was the reefs that were managed under the current IPM program in a year, and I've just used the Gabrumpa mapped area and perimeter data for those reefs, and then multiplied it up by 4 years for 5 vessels and compared it to the reefs in the combined initiation and dispersal boxes. And I think you'll see there that the numbers are reasonably comparable. It's a pretty risky extrapolation for all kinds of reasons, but I think the point to take home from this is that this comparison suggests that our capacity as it currently stands is not unreasonably matched to the challenge that we're likely to face in the next outbreak. And I think that's a really positive message for us. So just to wrap up, what I want to say is that the IPM control strategy that we're currently using is a really solid foundation for COTS control. And it's really transformed the way COTS control is performing, not just operating on the GBR. As I said, we've taken an effective tool and turned it into a really potent means of achieving objectives. One of the original complaints is that the control is prohibitively expensive. COTS control at the moment costs on the order of $12 million a year. Depending how you look at it, we're talking about billions of dollars worth of value per year from the GBR for the Australian economy. So the COTS control is roughly 0.2% of the value of our asset. And if any of you own assets, you'll know that that's actually not a vast amount of money to spend on maintaining a really valuable asset. So this is not an expensive program. It's quite a reasonable cost. And one of the major things going into the future, the thing that is really going to determine our ability to manage COTS is not our ability to actually kill the things, it's our ability to pay for it. And so a major goal of this group has to be focused on ensuring that COTS control is financially supported, not just for the next 3 years, but indefinitely, until we have solved the issues for the GBR. I think there's a strong potential that this program can actually meet the challenge of the next outbreak, but it is not designed, the decision processes that we're currently using, the way we distribute our effort and deploy our resources are not appropriate for meeting the challenge of the next outbreak. And in a talk tomorrow, I'll outline some of the reasons why I think that, and some of the things that I think we need to change as part, hopefully, of the CSIP program in order to enable us to meet that challenge. And I have to say, I think the CSIP program is actually going to be a really good foundation for us to be able to do that. So thank you.